Paul Diffley, thanks for joining us today.
Pleasure.
So you've made a film, A Dream of Edwin Drummond, and it is going to be available on demand very shortly. So we thought it'd be nice to have a quick catch up and talk about not just the film, but also about who is Ed Drummond. And, my knowledge of Ed Drummond extends to not necessarily first and foremost, but his writing.
Yeah.
Very powerful writer, an incredible poet, and he is someone that I feel, and this is going to sound really pretentious, but it's true, but he is someone who I feel blended his poetry and his climbing, his writing and his climbing. His view of the world, I feel, is quite a unique thing, in that there is a creativity and just something. He thinks outside the box linguistically and with his roots, and that's a thing. So do you want to tell us a bit more about what Ed Drummond, who the hell is Ed Drummond for you?
Yeah, you're right about the link between the climbing and the writing. They go together very well. And his writing is, when I first tried to read it, I found it incredibly hard to read, to be honest. He's not afraid of breaking all the rules of English, and then even breaking out of English and putting some Latin in there, a little bit of French, some references to Greek mythology, and they're all intertwined about a route on Cloggy. So it's hard to separate the two, really. And I think he really kind of lived these moments as well. He wasn't happy just to do a great climb. He wanted to do a great climb and then write about it. It was all linked into to his existence, really.
And I think on the note of his climbs as well, I guess A Dream of White Horses is the logical place to begin because it's become such a classic. It is the route to do at Gogarth. And I know it's a real, it's a well-traveled route these days, but I remember meeting someone who was there on the day of the first ascent, and apparently, that back wall, the sort of final sweeping traverse pitch, was, it looks unlikely by today's standards, so it must have been even less likely back then. But apparently, the rock was obviously way more friable, so loose holds coming off, big blocks. Mm-hmm. And so I guess that's the sort of entry-level route. But the routes that you put up, things like Archangel on, Stanage, that's a single pitch, really bold creation on the one hand, and then you've got things like the multi-day siege of the Long Hope. Mm-hmm. That is a portfolio of routes to have.
Very different as well. Look at Archangel. It's what is it? 15 meters at the most. Maybe probably less than that. But it's such a striking line. It's just obvious line. You see it from the car park, wouldn't you? It's beautiful and very difficult, elegant climbing. And then you compare that to Dream, and Dream's it's actually it's almost convoluted. The route. It starts way at one side of the cliff and then traverses all the way around and ends up on on that last pitch, that overhanging pitch, because you're passing through overhanging terrain, but on VS climbing ground. It's not hard climbing, but if you mess up, if you fall off from there without good gear, you're going to end up hanging in space. I'm surprised people don't have more epics there.
I am too. I remember doing it back when I was the sort of back when HVS was probably my limit, and I remember having this moment on about the stance on pitch 3 where somehow I've managed to unclip my wires from my rack and they just dropped into the sea below and they were gone. But yeah, I guess that's the thing as well, is a lot of his routes have extended throughout my own climbing career. I've never climbed the Long Hope, but things like A Midsummer Night's Dream on Cloggy, again, that's his, I guess, creation, because he wasn't always he was an unconventional and I guess provocative figure. Mm-hmm. He, placed bolts where he maybe, could he, shouldn't he? Who knows? History will judge. But, he was occasionally known on routes like Linden at Kerber to have chipped holds and then used sky hooks, that were lashed around his wrists. Mm-hmm. That is not normal behavior, but it goes to show this creative spark that he had just to push the boundaries of what the hell was normal?
Yeah, and I know when we talk about, he drilled holes, in gritstone and then used them for, that just sounds horrific to today's standards of ethics. But you have to look at that in the context of like 1960. It wasn't like that long ago that people were banging pegs into London Wall, and ripping them out again. And he's quoted about Lyndon as saying, he says something, they quote something like, when you're at the cutting edge, I was at the cutting edge and I felt it was acceptable to blunt on that edge a little bit. I realize now I was wrong.
Yeah.
So, and the same about the bolt on Mid-Northern Street, again in Cloggy, was not the last person to place a bolt on Cloggy, and never without controversy. But he talks about being crucified in his writing, and almost running away to America after that, So he was always trying to push the standards, push what he could do, what he could achieve, and if that meant bending an ethic, then so be it. And that's been the case in climbing. There's often ethics have always been bent, and then some become established, like chalk, for instance, or sport climbing, or the use of 2 axes rather than using 1 axe only in Scottish winter. These are ethics. These are against the ethics at the time, but then they become accepted. Luckily, no one has accepted drilling holes in gritstone and skyhooking up, but it's easier for us to judge, with our eyes now.
So you, I guess, first came across him, whilst you were making The Long Hope, which was originally, I think I'm right in saying, planned to be very much a film focusing on Dave MacLeod's first free ascent of The Long Hope. However, Ed Drummond came into the picture for you, and it would suffice to say that the film's destiny, or the film's sort of, plot or the storyline changed quite significantly when that happened.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I think Dave and Claire MacLeod were planning to make the films themselves initially, and because the year before, 2 years before, they made Echo War. Claire had kind of shot and directed that, and I think she was planning to do the same. But I think when she saw the cliff, and she just realised this wasn't going to be for her, hanging off a 400-meter cliff filming. And she it was too big, so we decided to collaborate. So it's kind of a co-production between me and Claire and Dave. And although I'd heard of Ed before, because I started climbing properly around '86 or something like that. So he was off in America by then, I think. So he wasn't really around on the scene, but I'd heard a few stories. And I think I climbed Dream in probably about '87 or '88 or something like that. I mean, I'm just making these numbers up. I don't know, a long time.
Good news is, if you say them with confidence, we'll believe you.
Yeah. But so I hadn't really thought about Ed Drummond for a long time. And then I did the first interview with Dave about The Long Hope, the establishing interview, like, what's this film about? What's this story? What's this route you're going to do, Dave? Because I didn't really know much about it, And then he at that point, Dave told me about the story of Ed spending 7 days climbing the first ascent. I think it's actually 5 days living on the wall, but 7 days in total, because it took him like 2 days to get down there, because it's a really remote cliff. Have you ever been to it, Rob?
So I've climbed on Hoy, and we did the Old Man of Hoy. And one evening, we just thought after doing the Old Man, we thought we'd walk up to go and see the cliff. And actually, it transpired to be a lot further than we thought. And I had some sort of hypoglycemic meltdown just walking, because we've been climbing all day. So I got to the top of the cliff, to view across to it, and I was having some sort of meltdown without even having done it. But I know people who've said that, as you alluded to just there, the descent alone is an experience, let alone the climbing back up to the top of it.
I forgot about the descent. And actually, I've done the descent 3 or 4 times, maybe more, and it's horrific every time, both up and down. Because it's really steep, grassy, loose, and you have to weave, and there's crags along the way as well, so you have to kind of weave your way through it. There's a route, And in fact, Ed never knew that. Ed didn't discover that route. They did the big long abseil down the cliff on the first ascent, that was a full day's abseiling, 400 meters, and it's steep as well. It's not like 400 meters flat, I know Oliver thought he would. Well, Oliver thought he was going to die, on the abseil. Oliver was his climbing partner, his second for those 5 days, and Ed also did the shopping for that trip. So he did all the food shopping, and Ed's, he's a poet, he's an artist. He's not a logistics man, you know. He's not a Bonington, you know. He's much more of a Johnny Dawes. And who would you rather have do your expedition shopping, you know, Bonington or Johnny Dawes, you know? So, you know, so he bought. Well, Oliver says he mostly bought licorice, right, to eat on the wall. You know, just bags of licorice and dates and some tinned fish. That was kind of what they had, you know, really basic supplies. And they'd been and they think so. It must have taken them a day to walk the gear up to the crag, and then a day to abseil. So that's the first 2 days gone, and then 5 days on the wall. But the abseil down, it took like, I think it took 2 or 4 hours, it wasn't actually an abseil. Oliver was lowered down. I don't know you, but I hate being lowered down on a rope. You know, occasionally it happens. You know, it's that lack of control compared to abseiling where you know you're in control. Just being lowered. You know, so he's lowered, and then of course Ed didn't have a 400-meter rope, you know, but he did have 4 100-meter ropes. Right? So he'd get to the end of a 100-meter rope, and then he would kind of hold the belay, tie him off, and then tie up, you know, log it off with a sling or something, and then just drop. So every 100 meters, Ollie would be swinging in space. And bear in mind, he's wearing a harness, but a primitive harness, and off his harness are the kit bags. So the kit bags, are like, you know, he's got 60k of kit bags pulling him down, and then every 100 meters he does this, like, you know, 10-foot drop. And he got to the bottom and he was really sore because he'd been hanging in a harness with kit bags off him for hours, you know. It's impossible to think. And then in the morning when he wakes up, you know, does his like ablutions. This is Oliver. And he was convinced he had internal bleeding because there was all this kind of dark matter in his stool. And then, you know, he went to show Ed. He said, Dad, I can't continue. There's no way I can start this climb. I've got internal bleeding. You've got to call the Coast Guard. You've got to get me out of here, you know. Anyway, Ed, like, examines the evidence, you know, and says, no, mate, that's licorice.
Well, it's perhaps unsurprising that as a result of just this story alone, that I think the thing that made the greatest impact on me within the Long Hope was Ed walking, you know, in his dotage, you know, to the summit. And do you want to say a bit about his physical condition at that time as well, and how it changed, I guess, over the years? Yeah,
well, I mean, the first time I met him was in the airport on the mainland in Orkney, and that's what they call it, you know. And I was a bit worried I wouldn't recognise him. Never met him before. And then this guy walked in, he had a bright coloured hat on and an old fleece, and I just thought, oh yeah, that's definitely Ed, you know. But I could see the way he was moving. He was moving slowly, carefully, and he had a slight tremor about him. So I mean, he'd been suffering from Parkinson's for over 20 years by then, or about 20 years by then. So he'd stopped climbing a while back. He managed to keep climbing for a while, but then it stopped. And he saw that walk was a great challenge for him. And we talk all day about it as well. It's not a trivial walk, as you said. In fact, I remember on one of the first days on that shoot, we're walking in, and we're walking with these massive ropes. I must have been carrying at least 60k, you know, because we had ropes, cameras. We also had we had massive steel poles to bang in the ground at the top because there's no belay on top. You know? And there's 2 routes up there. There's the one where you walk past the old man and go that way. There's another walk if you go on the other side of the island, but that's like that. It's like just a steep hill. You know, there's no, at least on the other way, that's gradual and winds around. This is just like, and Dave McLeod said, no, this is much quicker. You know, you've seen it on the map. It looks much shorter, you know. And actually, if you are Dave McLeod and you're really fit, you know, and you used to, you know, stomping up the Ben, then that's maybe nothing. But when you're me, who's not actually that fit and carrying a 60k rucksack, I remember I stopped and I was just like bright red face, sweating and just, you know, exhausted. And Lucas Wojcicka, you know, photographer, was there, and he was there with his partner, and she looked down at me. And apparently Lucas told me afterwards, she said to him, is Paul okay? It looks like he's about to die. So it wasn't just a struggle for Ed. It's a struggle for anyone to get to this place, but for Ed particularly. So we took the whole day to do it. There's myself, Matt Pycroft was on second camera as well, and the three of us with Ed walked up, and we had to stop. We stopped like twice for like extended breaks, and Ed would have a sleep for like an hour or something. I remember Matt saying he woke up and I was asleep, Ed was asleep, and he started looking over. And he said he couldn't see Ed moving at all. He's almost putting his hand over his mouth to sort of see he was alive. So we were concerned about his health. Yeah, for sure.
But obviously, it changed the film. His involvement changed the film dramatically, I think, from my perspective. Yeah. And I'm sure that for yours, it having Ed along must have changed the experience and the direction dramatically from what maybe you'd originally envisaged for the film.
Yeah, I guess without that story, imagine this was a first ascent as opposed to a first free ascent. Yeah, it would be, it'd all have been about McLeod and the process of doing a first ascent, and which is itself is a valid story for a film. But as soon as we had the historical angle, then that just changed it for me. And and I read the account that's in here, which is really good. It's Incumbent Hills. It's quite a long account. And when I first read it, I was kind of struggling a bit with it. But then I worked with an actor, a very fine actor who played Macbeth in Glasgow, and is actually in Outlander now. He's really good, actually, really good guy. And he, and when he voiced it, suddenly it just came alive. And then combine that with the archived photographs which Ed and Oliver took on the route, suddenly a little bit of magic starts to happen,
Wednesday, 22nd of July. Corpse prostrate, we shared his food. If he resented sharing his food, he didn't show it. The wind had dropped. The night was over. Nailing up this brittle crack in the wall, only way to go, I placed a bolt in case the insane flick above me would not be trod on, and I had no choice but to edge up to what, in my mockery of the night before, I had called the guillotine. The thin crack I am knifing in dies, so I ask for it and climb out of the trench of my aid slings and start running. My ropes run under the flake, butter to knives if it breaks. Fall forever or run forever.
And it also helps to maybe set Dave's ascent in context as well, because Dave had to do all of that climbing as well and then climb the 8C pitch at the end.
It's fascinating because in a way the contrast between them both embracing what is fundamentally, I guess, the same or a similar challenge, yet doing so in very different ways. I mean, I bet Dave, for one, was grateful to not have to climb it over 5 days, sleeping on the wall and the such like.
Yeah. And I think, Dave's obviously quite keen on nutrition. I think he definitely took more than, the licorice with him,
And so obviously that sounds to be quite an intense experience, intense filming experience. And there must have been something forged between the two of you there, because obviously to come back and now make a second film about him, what was your decision to delve back and take another look at his life?
I mean, that's true. There's something there. And it wasn't just like the 2 or 3 days we kind of spent together on Hoy. I was there on Hoy for 2 weeks on that shoot. And luckily Dave did the route on his first attempt. Luckily for him, I'd have preferred him to fall off, if I'm honest. I mean, it makes for a better story. And everyone thought, he actually says on the radio, "I'm going to fall off now." So, I was ready for him to fall off on that crux pitch. I even remember radioing to Matt, "Compose for a fall," the long shot. So, but that's an aside. But it wasn't just the fact I'd spent time with it. I think because I then, for the next 6 months, edited the film and read a lot of his material, and I had Ed's voice in my head all the time, Ed's voice voiced by the actor in my head all the time. So I think that it kind of burns into your brain a little bit, It's a bit like if you say you at school, you study one particular book and you don't just read it, but you study it, and then 20 years later you look back and you still know all the plot and character of Mice and Men, or 1984 in my case. These books, they just stay with you. And it was a bit like that because I'd studied it and studied Ed. It was kind of in my head.
And on that note, actually, an introduction you gave to the film at the Kendal Mountain Festival, I think you said within that something along the lines of just be prepared that this is going to be a little different to your average climbing film in the way. I think I've forgotten whether you used the word psychedelic or not, but it has its moments where initially you just like, this is again. I think what I can see is what you've brought out in the film is probably what's been in your head, or what's been implanted in your head by Ed, and that is this creativity, this unusual sort of styling that goes on. Some of the animations that go on within the film, again, are like something that, alternative, I think, is probably the best way to word it.
Yeah, I put that disclaimer on the Kendall thing, because if people had watched my previous films, they might be expecting like a classic documentary format, talking heads, a proper structure, a narrative. And there's lots of reasons why this film's a little bit out there. I mean, partly it's because it does reflect Ed's character, but also it is a lockdown project as well. In some way, the film is a produce of lockdown last year. I mean, as you know, Ed passed away in May 2019. So I'd already shot these short films which played into the live event at Kendall. So I'd already shot Dream, Archangel, Great Wall. We had this amazing event at Kendall where the family were there and people were doing readings of his poetry. We had live music, and then these new films, some old archive, both from Blanco and some other archive which I'd stolen from somewhere. And I just knew it was such a great event. But like theatre, it only happened once, and that was it. You were there or you weren't. So 250 people got to see it. And now I wanted to make a film. That was the motivation, really, to try and capture that magic that happened, at Kendall that year, but put it into a film so other people can enjoy it and feel it as well.
So very sadly, I wasn't there, which I definitely was something I was aware of, really missed out on. But like you say, so I knew what went on there, and one of the things that I like the most about the film is the integration, I guess, of his family members who were a part of the session at Kendall. So his son has written a lot of the music, written and performed a lot of the music within the film. And his daughter as well has several fantastic readings, I think interviews. Mm-hmm. And it's really emotional. I think that for me, the blend of this, in his youth, there's that impression of invulnerability almost, or invincibility. And I think challenges like the Long Hope, these big, impossible challenges, he almost made his life harder by choosing to climb it with someone who was either not a climber or an inexperienced climber. I mean, it's not logical, is it? But again, it's so very Drummond. And then obviously that contrast with his family life, and also with his age and his Parkinson's, there's much like his roots, there's just a man of real contrast there, isn't there?
Mm. Yeah, I think that's true. He is a man of contrast. His son says the same about him, as a son, I think he had a difficult relationship with him at times, particularly when he was younger. And but there's also great love and respect there between them as well. He sort of, I'm paraphrasing a little bit, but I remember this was in Kendall 2011 when we just done Longcoat. Howard got on stage afterwards to sort of sing this song, Original Rockstar, which is how the film finishes. And he sort of said, "Oh, my dad's funny. There's times I really hate him. He'd just disappear and go climbing and forget about his family, and that's really hard to deal with as a child. But then I look at my dad, and he climbed, Nelson's column in Trafalgar Square to protest against apartheid. How can you not respect that? Love that. What an example to set. So he sees him as both a warning and an example to him. So it's interesting, the family stuff. Yeah." He did have a complex personal life, I think. I mean, this is the other thing, is that, the things that he's done, you have to be a very driven individual to do a lot of that stuff. Mm-hmm. And, the way in which he did it, we've already mentioned, was quite controversial. It doesn't strike me like in his youth he was potentially an easy person to be around as a result of that. And yet the figure you see in later life, mm-hmm. and, this is in spite of challenges, obviously huge physical challenges,
he comes across as quite philosophical and resolute. He mentions something about within the film along the lines of, it's for him now, he's almost doing up his back when he was alive, doing up his shoelaces almost. Gaining that something from that experience, that is almost maybe akin to what he would have done achieving within his own climbing at the time.
You hear similar things from people who have, near-death experiences or really bad traumatic accidents which alter them, and suddenly they can appreciate the whole world in a way that we do not, because, like he talks about, the beauty is all around, the challenge is to see it, revere it, and move on to spread the good word that the world's doing okay. It's all burned into my head, but so you're living at the local level. You're not doing it. You're not doing the kind of grand big climbs anymore. But just by stopping and looking at a flower or a rock formation or the way the grass is moving in the wind is just as beautiful, if not more, than anything. Any big adventure or big mountain. He just appreciates the smaller things in life. Maybe.
I definitely got to the end of the film wishing to see the world through his eyes a little more often than I do, because it's easy to get wrapped up in a variety of things, and be that it could be performance is a frequent one to get wrapped up in these days, because we all want to climb either better or harder or something like that.
More so than ever. That's definitely changed in the last 10 years, I think. It's
definitely that where a lot of people's orientation is these days. And for me, one of the major take-home messages of the film was to appreciate maybe some of the other things. I've enjoyed writing about climbing experiences as well, so maybe it encouraged me to do a little bit more of that as well, simply to reflect then on those experiences you do have. And I think these are all really positive things to do ahead of the year that we've had, really, because it's been a flipping strange 12 to however many months now it's been, and as we go back out again, it's just that embracing of the outdoors or our bodies or the environment. It's probably a nice way to wrap up maybe what we've been talking about, but that for me is a nice way to think about how I'm going to begin my 2020 as and when the winter finally decides that it's vacated the premises and restrictions ease a little. I mean, what would be a better tonic for 3 months in lockdown than going to climb a Dream of White Horses? Exactly. Well, there's probably countless more things we could cover, Diff, and it's really sad that we can't necessarily cover them all. But do you want to tell us when the film is going to be available and how people can go about watching it?
Sure. Well, we're going to release the film on the 10th of March, and it's going to be on Vimeo VOD. I'm also going to upload it to Wheelhouse as well, which is another streaming site.
Brilliant.
The trailers going to release on the same day as well. So.
And we've got a bit of activity planned on site in the meanwhile with, I think, the Great Wall reading, haven't we? So that is something which will give you an insight into his mind. And if you watch it on repeat, your mind too, as the listener, can end up like Paul Diffley's. So if you want an insight into what it's like to be in Ed Drummond's mind, and therefore more recently Paul Diffley's mind, check that out, because it's quite something to behold. And keep an open mind.
That's great. Thanks, Rob.
Cheers, Paul.